January 1945. Somewhere in Belgium. The convoy halts on a frozen road scarred by artillery. Steam rises from the engines of American trucks idling in the early morning cold. Soldiers in olive drab stand in loose clusters, their breath visible in the air, rifles slung casually over shoulders. They smoke cigarettes and stamp their boots against the ice. The war has ground forward for months now, a relentless machine of men and metal pushing eastward through the snow dot in the back of one truck. Beneath a tarp stiff with frost sits a prisoner. Not the kind they expected. Her name is recorded in the processing logs as Unteroffizier Ilse Hirsch, though the name will later prove false. A cover in a conflict where truth itself became tactical. She wears a Wehrmacht greatcoat too large for her frame, the collar pulled high against the wind. Her hands are bound loosely with rope, not chains. The American MP who secured her did so almost apologetically, his movements hesitant, uncertain. He had never taken a woman prisoner before. She does not look at him. Her eyes remain fixed on the floorboards, where ice crystals have formed in the grooves of the wood. There is something in her stillness that unsettles the men around her, not defiance. Not fear, but a kind of hollow resignation, as though she has already crossed some internal border from which there is no return. One of the soldiers, a corporal from Ohio, leans toward his sergeant and mutters, "She don't look like no soldier." The sergeant, older, grayer, doesn't answer. He has seen enough by now to know that war reshapes everyone it touches. In the winter of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing inward like a dying star. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, had failed. The snow that had once concealed German tanks and paratroopers now buried their wreckage. American forces, alongside their British and Canadian allies, pressed into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine, liberating towns and villages that had lived under the swastika for a decade. Among the millions swept up in this final spasm of the war were not only soldiers, but also civilians pressed into service. Volkssturm militias, teenagers in ill-fitting uniforms, and women, far more women than Allied intelligence had anticipated. The Nazi regime, in its desperation, had mobilized every able body. The Luftwaffe's auxiliaries, the signals corps, the anti-aircraft units. By 1944, women comprised a significant portion of Germany's defensive infrastructure. They operated searchlights, decoded transmissions, loaded flak guns. Some, particularly in the fanatical remnants of the Hitler Youth and werewolf resistance cells, took up arms. The Allies were unprepared for this. American soldiers, raised on ideals of chivalry and the sanctity of womanhood, found themselves disarmed not by bullets, but by the sight of a woman in uniform standing in the rubble of a bunker, a rifle in her hands. The cognitive dissonance was profound. This was not the war they had imagined. This was not the enemy they had trained to fight. And so, when women like Ilse Hirsch were captured, the men who took them prisoner often did not know what to do. The official protocols were clear: process them like any other POW, search for intelligence, send them to the rear. But the emotional reality was far more complicated, because beneath the coat, beneath the insignia and the propaganda, was a wound no one had expected to find. The processing camp is a sprawl of tents and barbed wire erected in the courtyard of what had once been a Belgian school. The walls are pocked with shrapnel. The windows are empty frames. Inside, captured Germans sit in rows on the floor, silent and sullen, guarded by young Americans who pace with rifles across their chests. The air smells of wet wool and disinfectant. Ilse is brought to a side tent reserved for female prisoners. There are only 3 others: a nurse, a radio operator, and a girl of no more than 16 who weeps quietly into her hands. An American nurse, Lieutenant Mary Thornton, conducts the initial medical examination. She is efficient, professional, her movements brisk. She has processed dozens of prisoners in the past weeks. Men mostly, some wounded, some sick, all exhausted. But when she asks Ilse to remove her coat, something shifts. Ilse hesitates. Her hands, though unbound now, remain folded in her lap. She does not meet the nurse's eyes. "I need to check for injuries," Lieutenant Thornton says in careful German, learned from a phrasebook and sharpened by repetition. "It's regulation." Ilse's voice is soft, almost inaudible. "Please be careful." The words hang in the air. Lieutenant Thornton frowns. Careful of what? A wound? An injury sustained in combat? Slowly, Ilse unbuttons the coat. Beneath it, she wears a threadbare tunic, standard issue, stained with mud and sweat. But as she lifts the hem, the nurse sees it. Not a bullet wound. Not shrapnel, bruises, dark mottled bruises that spread across her ribs like ink stains. Some fresh, some older, fading into yellow and green. And lower, on her abdomen, more marks' handprints, unmistakable in their shape. Lieutenant Thornton's pen stills. She has seen wounds of every kind in this war. She has sutured men whose intestines spilled into her hands. She has held soldiers as they died. But this is different. Who did this? She asks, though she already knows the answer will not come easily. Ilse does not reply. She pulls the tunic back down and refastens the coat. Her face remains blank, as if she has learned to sever herself from her own body, to exist somewhere beyond pain. Lieutenant Thornton makes a note in her log. She does not know what else to do. History does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it whispers. In the grand narratives of World War II, the landings at Normandy, the fall of Berlin, the raising of flags on conquered soil, there are countless smaller stories that go unrecorded. The testimonies of women like Ilse Hirsch are among them. For decades, their voices were buried beneath the rubble of a war that had no language for what they endured. The Third Reich, for all its pageantry of strength and purity, was a regime built on violence, not only against its enemies, but against its own people. Women in the Wehrmacht and affiliated organizations existed in a paradox. They were told they were vital to the war effort, that their service was honorable, that they were building a new world. But they were also reminded, constantly, that they were women first, and soldiers second. Sexual violence within the German military was more common than post-war records initially suggested. For decades, it was hidden, erased, dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht persisted. The idea that the regular army, unlike the SS, had conducted itself with honor. But testimonies from women who served, collected slowly over the decades by historians willing to listen, tell a different story. Many women were assaulted by their own officers. Some were coerced into relationships with superiors under threat of reassignment to more dangerous posts. Others were victims of systemic abuse in units where discipline had collapsed under the strain of defeat. The ideology that had once promised them purpose and protection had rotted from within, and when the Allies arrived, these women carried those wounds into captivity, into a new kind of silence, because how could they speak of it? To whom? Their captors were the enemy. Their own countrymen had betrayed them. The world was not ready to hear that the victims of war were more numerous and more complicated than anyone had imagined. Lieutenant Thornton reports the findings to her commanding officer, a captain named Dawson who oversees the POW operations in the sector. He listens in silence, his expression unreadable. "Did she say who?" he asks finally. "She won't speak," Thornton replies. But the injuries are consistent with assault. Multiple instances, over time. Captain Dawson rubs his face. He is 32 years old and feels twice that. The war has aged everyone. He thinks of his wife back in Pennsylvania, of the daughter he has never met, born while he was overseas. He wonders what kind of world she is growing up in. "Document it," he says, "and keep her separate from the male prisoners. I don't want any more trouble, that's it." Thornton's voice sharpens. Sir, she's been. I know what she's been, Dawson interrupts, not unkindly. But she's also a German soldier. Or was. We follow protocol. We treat her humanely. That's all we can do. Thornton leaves the tent, frustration simmering beneath her professionalism. She knows he is right. She also knows it is not enough. In the days that follow, Ilse is moved to a larger POW facility in France, then eventually to England, where German prisoners are held in camps scattered across the countryside. The journey is long and cold. She travels in trucks and trains, always under guard, always silent. The other female prisoners, there are more now, as the Allies sweep deeper into Germany, speak in whispers. Some cry, some rage. Others, like Ilse, retreat into themselves, building walls that no interrogator can breach. The American and British authorities struggle with how to handle them. The male prisoners are easier. There are established systems, clear hierarchies, predictable routines. But the women disrupt those systems. They cannot be housed with the men. They cannot be treated with the same blunt efficiency. Their presence raises uncomfortable questions. One British officer, tasked with overseeing a camp in Yorkshire, writes in a letter to his superiors, "These women are not like the men. They do not respond to discipline in the same way. Many seem broken not by battle, but by something else. I do not know what to do with them." The Red Cross becomes involved. Medical personnel, social workers, translators. Slowly, carefully, some of the women begin to speak. What emerges is a pattern. Greta, a former flak auxiliary from Hamburg, describes being assaulted by her commanding officer after a bombing raid destroyed half her unit. She was 18. Annalise, a radio operator, recounts being forced into a relationship with a senior lieutenant who threatened to report her family to the Gestapo if she refused. Marguerite, a nurse, speaks of a field hospital where the doctors and orderlies preyed on the women under their care, knowing that no one would believe the accusations, knowing that the chaos of war provided cover. And Ilse, eventually, in a quiet room with Lieutenant Thornton present, speaks to. Her story is not unique. That is the horror of it. She had volunteered in 1943, believing the propaganda, believing that service was noble. She was assigned to a logistics unit, then to a signals post near the Eastern Front. The officer in charge, she does not say his name, began with small violations. Comments, touches, then demands. "I thought if I did what he wanted, it would stop," she says, her voice barely above a whisper. But it didn't. It never stopped. When her unit was overrun by the Red Army, she fled west, joining a retreating column of Wehrmacht soldiers. By the time the Americans found her, she had been wearing a uniform for 2 years and had not known a single day of safety. Lieutenant Thornton writes it all down. She does not know if it will matter, but she writes it anyway. The symbolic object that follows Ilse through this story is not a weapon or a flag, but something far simpler. Soap. In the American camps, the prisoners are given soap. Real soap, white and clean-smelling, wrapped in paper. It is a small thing, but it astonishes them. German soldiers, especially in the final months of the war, had lived in filth. There was no soap, no clean water, no time for anything but survival. Ilse holds the bar in her hands, turning it over. She does not use it immediately. She keeps it in her pocket, taking it out sometimes to look at it, as if to confirm it is real. Lieutenant Thornton notices this. One day, she asks why. "It means I am still human," Ilse says simply. Soap, the most basic marker of civilization, of care, of a world where people are allowed to be clean, to be whole, to be safe. The Americans do not realize it. But in these small acts, soap, food, medical care, the absence of cruelty, they are dismantling an ideology more effectively than any bomb. Because the Reich had told its people that the enemy was barbaric, that capture meant torture and death. But instead, the prisoners find something unexpected. They find mercy. Not because the Americans are perfect, not because the war is just, but because the values embedded in democratic society, however imperfectly practiced, allow for the possibility of redemption, of treating even the enemy with a baseline of humanity. It is not propaganda. It is soap, it is food. It is a nurse who listens, and for women like Ilsa, it is the first time in years that someone has said, "Please be careful," and meant it as protection, not as a prelude to violence. The war ends. Germany surrenders. The camps empty slowly. Prisoners are processed, screened, released. Some return to shattered cities. Others remain in displaced persons camps, waiting for countries that no longer exist to reappear. Ilsa is released in the autumn of 1945. She is given civilian clothes, a little money, and papers that identify her as a former POW. She boards a train heading east, toward what remains of Germany. Lieutenant Thornton does not see her again, but she keeps the notes. Decades later, when historians begin to excavate the hidden stories of the war, those notes will become part of the record. The wound no one expected was not inflicted by the enemy. It was inflicted by the ideology that promised strength and delivered only suffering. The women who served the Third Reich, whether by choice or coercion, were betrayed by the very system. They were told to trust. And when they fell into the hands of the Allies, they discovered something that their own government had never offered: the possibility of being seen not as tools, not as symbols, not as bodies to be used and discarded, but as human beings deserving of care. This is not to absolve the Wehrmacht. It is not to erase the crimes committed under its banner. But it is to acknowledge that war devours everyone it touches, and that the wounds it leaves are not always visible. Ilsa's story is one among millions. Her name, if that was even her real name, does not appear in the history books. There are no monuments to her suffering, no plaques commemorating her survival, but the soap she carried in her pocket, the careful hands of a nurse who documented her wounds, the American captain who ordered her separated from further harm. These small acts of humanity mattered. They mattered because they represented a choice to see the person beneath the uniform, a choice to extend mercy even when it was not required. And in a war defined by mechanized death and industrial cruelty, those choices were acts of resistance against the very logic of the conflict. In the end, history is not only the story of battles won and lost. It is also the story of moments like these, quiet, unwitnessed, easily forgotten. A woman in a tent, a bar of soap in her hand, the first breath of safety after years of fear. "Please be careful," she said. And for once, someone was. That is the wound no one expected. Not a wound of the body, though those were real, but a wound of the soul, the discovery that the world she had been taught to believe in was a lie. And that kindness, when it finally came from the hands of the enemy. War is often remembered in terms of victory and defeat. But the true measure of a conflict is not only what it destroys, but what it reveals. And what the final days of World War II revealed, in the processing tents and POW camps where women like Ilsa Hirsch passed through, was this: that abundance is not only material, but moral. That freedom is not only the absence of chains, but the presence of care. That democracy, for all its flaws, carries within it the capacity to treat even the defeated with a dignity that totalitarianism can never offer, because totalitarianism consumes its own. It uses and discards. It promises everything and delivers only ash, but a bar of soap given freely. A nurse who listens. A record kept. A story preserved. These are the small, stubborn seeds of a different world. And in the winter of 1945, in a tent in Belgium, they were planted in the hands of a woman who had been told she was a soldier, but who learned, too late, that she had only ever been a casualty.